I'm tired of being the most ambitious person in this relationship, my fiancée said during a late-night argument while packing her things into suitcases. I quietly helped carry them to her car. 7 months later, she sat frozen in a coffee shop after hearing two strangers discuss my business success at the next table. I'm tired of being the most ambitious person in this relationship. She didn't shout it. That was the strange part. After 5 years together, after 11 months of wearing my ring, Felicity said those words the way you'd read a grocery list. Flat, measured, already decided. I was standing in the doorway of our bedroom. It was 11:47 at night. I remember because the digital clock on my nightstand was the only light in the room, and I remember staring at those numbers for a moment longer than I should have, as if they might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. She had 2 suitcases open on the bed. The large one, the navy blue Samsonite I'd bought her for our trip to Portugal 2 years ago, was already half full. The smaller one held shoes, books, the framed photo from her parents' anniversary dinner that had lived on our shared bookshelf for 3 years. I watched her fold a sweater, then another. Precise, practiced folds. The kind you do when you've been rehearsing a scene long before the curtain goes up. I said nothing for a long moment. Then, do you need help carrying those? Felicity stopped folding. She turned and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, somewhere between surprise and something almost like disappointment, as though she'd been expecting a fight and I'd just refused to give her one. Callum, it's late, I said. The elevator in this building is slow. I'll carry the big one. She stared at me. I walked to the closet and pulled a jacket off its hanger. At the time, standing in that doorway in a quiet apartment that still smelled like the dinner we'd cooked together 3 hours earlier, I thought I was losing my fiancée. I had no idea I was about to gain everything else. Here's what I thought I was losing that night, in no particular order. The woman I'd planned to marry in 14 months. The apartment we'd spent 2 weekends painting together. A specific shade of warm white she'd found in a design magazine, and I'd driven to 3 different hardware stores to match. The Sunday morning routine we'd built over 5 years, the one that involved bad coffee and good newspapers and her feet in my lap while she read. The future I'd been constructing in my head since the night I proposed on a rooftop in Brooklyn, the one that included a house eventually, and a dog she'd already unofficially named Theodore, and the kind of quiet, solid life I'd always believed in. I thought I was losing all of that. What I couldn't see, standing in that doorway at 11:47, was how much I'd already lost long before she started packing. The strange thing about that night, the thing that would take me weeks to fully understand, was how rehearsed it felt. Not in a performative way, not theatrical, just settled. The way Felicity moved through that bedroom, selecting which items were hers with a precision that suggested prior mental inventory. The way she didn't cry. The way she didn't hesitate over shared things, the throw blanket we'd bought together in Asheville, the cookbook with both our handwriting in the margins, as if she'd already adjudicated those questions privately, weeks ago. Something about that behavior lodged itself in my chest and stayed there. She'd been having this conversation in her head for months, maybe longer, and I'd been standing on the other side of a wall I didn't know existed, thinking we were having ordinary problems. I carried the navy suitcase to the elevator. She carried the small one. We rode down 6 floors in silence. The lobby was empty. Outside, the city was doing what New York always does at midnight, humming at a lower frequency, still awake, just quieter. I loaded her bags into her car. She stood on the sidewalk with her keys in her hand. Callum, she started. Drive safe, I said. It's late. She opened her mouth, closed it, got in the car. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the taillights until they disappeared around the corner. Then I went back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning the lights on. What I learned 7 months later explained everything. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. My name is Callum. I was 32 at the time of the breakup. Felicity was 31. We'd been together 5 years, engaged for 11 months. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens, not Manhattan, which I mention only because Felicity had started mentioning it with increasing frequency over the previous year. I owned a small business, home renovation consulting, not contracting, not design, but the intermediary space between them. Homeowners hire me to manage the process, sourcing contractors, overseeing timelines, keeping budgets from dissolving into chaos. It's unglamorous work. It involves a lot of phone calls and spreadsheets and conversations with people who are simultaneously spending more money than they've ever spent on anything and living in a construction zone. I'd been running it for 4 years. It was not failing. It was not spectacularly successful. It was exactly the kind of business that exists in a persistent middle state, covering its costs, occasionally profitable, never quite reaching the inflection point where you stop worrying about next quarter. Felicity worked in brand strategy at a mid-sized consultancy in Midtown. Good salary. Impressive title. The kind of job that comes with a corporate card and a conference in Chicago every April. She'd been promoted twice in 3 years, and she was good at it. Genuinely, observably good. She was sharp and well-organized, and she understood how to read a room in ways I'd always admired. Our friends, in the context of this story, were primarily 2 women. Georgia, who had been Felicity's roommate in college and was now a real estate agent in Manhattan, and Rosalie, who worked in PR and had introduced me and Felicity at a rooftop party in Williamsburg in what felt like another lifetime. They were both smart, both professionally successful, both part of a social orbit that revolved, more than I'd noticed at the time, around certain visible markers of achievement. I liked them both. I still do, in a complicated way. But I was aware, even before everything happened, that Georgia and Rosalie tended to speak about careers and apartments and life milestones in a particular tone, enthusiastic, comparative, tallying. The kind of social fluency that keeps score without ever admitting it's keeping score. I didn't fit neatly into that scoring system. Felicity did. That gap, small at first, a hairline crack, had been widening for longer than I'd allowed myself to see. The small moments came first. They always do. There was the dinner with Felicity's colleagues, maybe 8 months before the breakup. A restaurant in the West Village that was exactly the kind of place I found unnecessary, not because of the price, but because the lighting was engineered to make everyone look like they were being photographed. I'd worn a blazer. Felicity had looked at it when I came out of the bedroom and said, "That's fine," in a tone that meant it wasn't. At dinner, when the conversation turned to professional news, someone's promotion, someone's client win, Felicity spoke about her projects with ease and fluency. When someone asked what I did, she answered before I could. He runs his own business. Home renovations. Not inaccurate, but the brevity of it, the way the subject changed almost immediately after, sat in my stomach for the rest of the meal. There was the Sunday in March when we were at brunch with Georgia and Rosalie, and a couple I didn't know well, friends of Rosalie's, both of them in finance, the kind of people who drop the names of neighborhoods in the Hamptons the way other people mention subway stops. The man, Marcus, I think, was talking about a deal he'd closed, and the women were listening with an attention I recognized as the specific variety reserved for professional achievement. Felicity was leaning forward, animated. Later, walking home, she said, "He's impressive, right? Like, that kind of drive. I find that really attractive." She said it without apparent awareness of what she'd just said to her fiancé. I said, "Sure." She said, "You know what I mean. Ambition. It's a thing." I didn't answer. We walked the rest of the way home without talking. There was the comment she made to Georgia on a phone call I half overheard through the bathroom door. "He's comfortable, you know? Like, too comfortable." Followed by a laugh I didn't recognize. There were the backhanded compliments. "You're so laid back. I mean that in a good way, mostly. You'd be perfect if you were just a little more, I don't know, hungry. You have good instincts, you just don't always act on them fast enough." Each one small enough to dismiss. Together, they assembled into something I kept refusing to name. I told myself every couple went through phases. I told myself the stress of her work was leaking into her words. I told myself that 5 years of shared history counted for more than a series of dinner comments and loaded silences. I was right about some of that. I was wrong about the conclusion. One conversation at brunch changed how I saw everything. It was a Saturday in early October, 6 weeks before the breakup. We were at a place in the East Village that Rosalie had selected. Exposed brick, very good eggs, the kind of crowded weekend energy that Felicity loved and I tolerated. Georgia was there. Rosalie. A woman named Diane who worked with Georgia and who I'd met twice before. And a man named Fletcher who was, as far as I could tell, Georgia's current romantic interest. Tall, finance, insufferably well-dressed. Fletcher had just returned from a business trip to London. He was describing it in detail that suggested he found himself interesting, which he did. The women at the table were engaged. Felicity was asking follow-up questions. At some point the conversation shifted, the way brunch conversations do. toward the general topic of men and ambition. I'm not entirely sure how it got there. I was listening, not participating. My coffee was good. The eggs were fine. Then Felicity, gesturing lightly with her fork, said, "Callum's great. He's genuinely one of the best people I know. He's the kind of man that women appreciate more later in life." Pause. Let me be precise about what happened at the table in that moment. George's smile stiffened almost imperceptibly. Rosalie looked at her water glass. Diane, who didn't know me well enough to have a reaction, laughed lightly. Fletcher, to his minor credit, looked at me with an expression that acknowledged what had just happened. And Felicity took a sip of her mimosa. She did not look at me. Not immediately. When she did, briefly, her expression was the specific variety of casual that requires effort to produce. I smiled. I said nothing. I ate my eggs. He's the kind of man women appreciate more later in life. I've turned that sentence over many times since. It is a masterwork of a certain kind of social cruelty, the kind dressed as a compliment, the kind that insults the subject while performing affection, the kind that communicates to everyone in earshot exactly what the speaker thinks without ever technically saying it. It was a sentence that said, "He is not enough. Not now. Not for me. Not in the way that counts," wrapped in language gentle enough to deny intent if challenged. She didn't apologize. Not that day, not the following week. There was no quiet conversation later where she said, "That came out wrong." Nothing. I filed it somewhere deep and kept going. But something shifted in me that morning, sitting at that table with my coffee going cold. Something quiet and irreversible, the way a bone fractures beneath the surface before anyone can see the break. That wasn't the worst thing she said that month. The arguments that followed were not dramatic. That's the thing nobody tells you about relationships ending. It's rarely operatic. It's usually just a slow accumulation of friction, each conversation slightly more exhausting than the last, each repair attempt landing a little shorter than the one before it. Felicity became distant in October. Not absent. She was still there, physically, in the apartment, at dinner, in bed, but present in the way a building is present, occupying space without generating warmth. She mentioned her co-worker Daniel 3 times in 1 week. Daniel had just been promoted to director. Daniel had been headhunted by 2 firms. Daniel had bought a place in Tribeca. I was not, I want to be clear, concerned about Daniel in a romantic sense. What concerned me was the context in which his name appeared, always adjacent to a contrast, always in the vicinity of a comparison I wasn't meant to notice I was losing. She started talking about a future that didn't quite match the one we'd discussed. Larger apartment, better neighborhood, a certain kind of lifestyle that required a certain kind of income that my business, in its current state, was not producing. I want to be honest here. She wasn't wrong that there was a gap. She was wrong about what it meant and what it required. I'd been working on something. A pivot, not away from the business, but a restructuring that I'd been developing quietly for about 4 months by that point, in conversation with a mentor named Conrad, who I'll introduce properly shortly. It wasn't ready to announce. It didn't look like much from the outside. From the outside, it looked exactly like it always had. Callum and his modest renovation consultancy, managing timelines and making calls, comfortable and static. I hadn't told Felicity the full shape of it. Partly because it wasn't ready. Partly, if I'm honest, because something in me had started to understand that her confidence in my trajectory was not a resource I could rely on. Then I found the note. I want to be careful about how I describe this because it wasn't snooping and I don't want it to sound like snooping. She'd left her laptop open on the kitchen table. She was in the shower. I walked past, and the screen was visible, and I wasn't trying to read it, but the words were large enough to catch. It was a message to Georgia, an unsent draft, or maybe one she'd sent and returned to, I don't know. But the relevant portion, the portion I couldn't unread, said, "I love him, but I've stopped believing in where he's going. And I don't know how to tell him that I can't build a life on potential anymore." I stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then I walked to the living room and sat down and turned on the television and watched 11 minutes of a documentary about deep-sea fish without seeing any of it. She'd stopped believing in me. Not recently. You don't write sentences like that recently. That was the language of a conclusion someone had been sitting with long enough for it to become settled. I didn't confront her. I didn't leave. I spent the next 3 weeks trying anyway, the way you try when you already know the answer but can't yet bring yourself to stop asking the question. The breakup happened 3 weeks later. It was a Tuesday night. I know it was a Tuesday because I'd had a call with Conrad that afternoon, a long one, The kind where you hang up feeling like something is beginning, and I'd come home in a better mood than I'd been in for weeks. I'd picked up groceries. I'd made dinner. Felicity came home at 7:30. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her bag still on her shoulder and watched me stir pasta for a moment, and I knew from the quality of her silence that the conversation was coming. I just didn't know it would end the way it ended. We ate, or we sat at the table with food in front of us. I'm not sure how much eating happened. The conversation started quietly, the way these things always start, and then she said the sentence, "I'm tired of being the most ambitious person in this relationship." The apartment went very still. I looked at her. She was looking at the table. "I feel like I'm the only one who cares about where we're going," she continued. "Like I'm the one carrying the vision for our future while you're just comfortable. And I've tried. I've tried to talk to you about this. But nothing changes." I said, "You haven't tried to talk to me about this." "Not really." "Callum, you've made comments," I said, "at dinners and over the phone to Georgia and in ways I was supposed to hear but not address. That's not the same as talking." Something moved across her face. A flicker of something, not guilt, exactly. Closer to the recognition that she'd underestimated me. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've outgrown this. I've outgrown. I don't know how to say this without it sounding cruel." "Then just say it." "I've outgrown us." There it was. "I love you," she said. "I want you to know that. But love isn't enough. I need someone who's going somewhere. Who has a plan. Who makes me feel like the future we're building is real." I looked at her for a long time. I thought about the note on the laptop. I thought about the brunch. I thought about every quietly discarded compliment, every comparative comment, every moment she'd chosen to diminish instead of encourage. And then I thought about Conrad's voice on the phone that afternoon saying, "I think we're ready, Callum. I genuinely think we're ready." I didn't say any of that. I said, "Okay." Just that. "Okay." She blinked. "That's okay. Do you need help packing?" And then we were back to the opening scene. Except now you have all the context. Her precise movements through the bedroom. The already cataloged inventory of her possessions. The practiced quality of a woman doing something she decided to do a long time ago. I helped carry the Navy suitcase. I held the elevator. I stood on the sidewalk at 11:47 and watched the taillights disappear. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. No begging. No speech. No fight. Just, okay. The next 7 months changed everything. Conrad Marsh was 61 years old, semi-retired, and the most straightforwardly honest person I'd encountered in business. He'd spent 30 years building and selling service companies. Nothing flashy, nothing tech-adjacent, just businesses that solved operational problems and scaled through reputation. He'd been introduced to me 18 months earlier by a former client, and what had started as a single advisory conversation had slowly become something more significant. He called the way he found me that first meeting interestingly unfinished. He said I had the instincts of someone who should be doing more, but was making decisions like someone who expected less. He said the renovation consulting model was constrained not by market size, but by how I'd framed it, to myself and to clients. I'd been listening to him for months. Nodding, half implementing, still hedging. The night Felicity left, I sat in the dark for 2 hours and then I opened my laptop and wrote Conrad a message that said, "I'm ready. Whatever you've been waiting for me to say, I'm saying it now. Let's build it." He replied at 6 in the morning. It said, "Good. Come in Thursday. Here's what we built." The renovation consulting model had one core problem. I was selling time. My time. Which meant I could only scale as far as my own hours would stretch, and my own hours were finite. Conrad's insight, which I'd been circling for months without landing on, was this. The value I was actually providing wasn't project management. It was sourcing. It was my network of vetted contractors, my understanding of which materials held value and which were margin theater, my ability to forecast where projects would go wrong before they went wrong. That was a platform, not a service. The idea, stripped to its frame. A subscription-based platform connecting residential property owners with rigorously vetted contractors, with my firm acting as the verification and quality assurance layer. Not a marketplace in the Angie's List sense. Something tighter, more curated, with ongoing relationship management and project oversight as premium offerings. The technology wasn't complicated. The value was in the curation. Conrad had a contact. Preston Lyle, 44, formerly in PropTech, exited cleanly from his last venture 18 months prior and looking for the right next project. Conrad introduced us in early December, 3 weeks after Felicity left. Preston and I met at a diner in Midtown because Conrad had told me once that the right conversations happen in diners, and Conrad was right about most things. Preston ordered coffee and listened to my pitch for 20 minutes without interrupting. Then he said, "What's your contractor network actually worth? Like, if we stripped everything else away and just sold access to those relationships, what would someone pay?" I hadn't thought about it that way. I sat with the question for a moment. "More than I've been charging," I said. Preston smiled. "Yeah, let's talk." We were incorporated by January 15th. I'm going to tell you what the next 6 months actually looked like, because I think there's a version of this story that would skip over it, that would hand you a montage of hard work and then a success. I don't want to do that, because the texture of those months was the point. January was technical architecture and legal structure. Preston knew the tech side in ways I didn't. I knew the contractor relationships in ways he didn't. We divided it cleanly and met every Tuesday and Thursday, usually at a coffee shop on 34th Street that opened at 6 and had outlets at every table. February was outreach. I spent 3 weeks calling every contractor I'd ever worked with, not to pitch them exactly, but to ask questions. What do you hate about how clients find you? What makes a job go wrong before it starts? What would make your life easier? The answers were consistent enough that I started to feel the outline of something real. March was the first build. Rough, functional, embarrassing in retrospect, but ours. We ran it with 8 contractors and 6 test clients and watched where it broke. It broke in 4 places. We fixed 3 of them by April. The 4th took until May and required a conversation with a developer Preston knew in Austin who charged us more than we had budgeted and delivered something better than we'd specified. There were mornings in February. Cold mornings, the kind where New York feels specifically hostile. When I sat at that coffee shop table at 6:15 and stared at a spreadsheet, and felt the specific dread of someone who has bet on himself and isn't sure yet whether he should have. Not doubt about the idea, doubt about the timing, doubt about whether I was the person to execute it, doubt that arrived with Felicity's voice in it. "Comfortable," she'd said, "too comfortable," and sat in my chest until the coffee got warm enough. I kept going. There were good days too. The day our 3rd contractor signed a premium tier agreement and called me afterward to say it was the easiest business decision he'd made in 5 years. The Tuesday Preston sent me a message at 11 p.m. that said only, "Check the analytics." We'd had 47 signups in a single day from a piece a home renovation blogger had written about us without being asked. 47 people who had found us, read us, and given us their email addresses voluntarily. Conrad met us for dinner in April and listened to our quarterly numbers and said, "You're not there yet, but you're pointing the right direction." From Conrad, that was effusive. By May we had a waiting list. By June, we had 3 inbound investor conversations that Preston handled with the calm of someone who'd done this before while I tried to look like I had too. One of those conversations turned into a term sheet. The day we signed it, a warm Thursday in early June, in a conference room that cost more per hour than I used to make in a day, Preston and I went back to that diner on 34th Street and ordered the same coffee we'd ordered the first time and didn't say much. We just sat there for a while in the particular quiet of people who have built something together and know what it cost. Then Felicity accidentally heard something she wasn't supposed to hear. Georgia called me first. I want to note that, because it surprised me. Georgia, Felicity's college roommate, Georgia, who had been present at the brunch, called me on a Thursday evening in late June, and the fact of the call itself was information. "I wanted to check in," she said, which is what people say when they mean something more specific. We talked for a while. She asked about the business, which meant she already knew something about the business. She said she'd seen the article, which referred to a piece that had run in a property industry newsletter in May, the kind of trade publication that doesn't reach general audiences, but does reach people who are paying attention to a particular space. "You seem good," Georgia said, in a tone that meant, "You seem better than expected." "I am," I said, and meant it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "She's not. Callum, she's fine. I don't want you to think I'm calling to report on her, but I think she thought it would look different." I didn't ask what it referred to. I knew. "She's okay," I said. "She's okay," Georgia agreed. "But she thought. I think she thought the door would stay open longer." "That you'd." I didn't. "No," Georgia said. "You didn't." We said goodbye cordially. I stood in my kitchen afterward and thought about what she hadn't said, that Felicity had left expecting a particular shape to the aftermath, and the aftermath had not conformed. Rosalie called 2 weeks later, more directly. She'd been talking to a colleague who'd met Preston at some industry event and had made the connection. She wanted me to know she thought it was great. She sounded genuinely warm, and I believed her. Rosalie was never malicious. She was just someone who lived inside a particular social framework without questioning it, and I was someone who had been on the wrong side of that framework for a while. "There's talk," she said. "People in certain circles are noticing the company. You should know that." I thanked her. "Does she know?" Rosalie asked. "I don't know what she knows," I said honestly. "She'll find out," Rosalie said. "These things have a way. Through the network of mutual connections that New York makes inevitable, the city is enormous and the social circles inside it are not." Other information filtered toward me. Felicity was still at her consultancy. She'd been passed over for a promotion she'd been expecting, which I heard about secondhand and felt nothing about except a mild wish that it had gone differently for her. She was dating someone, a detail I filed away without the ache I might have expected. She was living in a sublet in Murray Hill that Georgia described, with careful neutrality, as temporary. The large, sunlit future she'd described, the one that required a different kind of partner, had not yet materialized. Not in 7 months, which was perhaps not sufficient time, but it was time enough for certain assumptions to have begun their quiet revision. I felt no satisfaction about any of this. That surprised me a little. I'd expected to feel something sharper, not vindictiveness, but at least a clean "I told you" so that could be turned over and examined. Instead, what I felt was closer to a kind of sad clarity. She'd made a calculation. The calculation had felt rational to her at the time. The variables were now resolving differently than she projected. That's not a victory. It's just math. 2 weeks later, she walked into that coffee shop. She didn't know I was nearby. I need to establish that clearly, because the proximity was coincidental. Preston's office by that point was in a building on 22nd Street, and I had a standing Wednesday meeting there that I often followed with coffee at a place half a block away. A neighborhood spot. Nothing curated or designed. Just a room with good light and reliable espresso and the particular ambient hum of a city going about its business. I wasn't there when it happened. I heard about it afterward, from 2 sources who didn't know each other, which gave the account a credibility it might not have had from one. Here's what I've reconstructed. Felicity had been meeting a friend for coffee. Not Georgia, someone from work, a woman named Petra I'd never met. They'd arrived mid-morning. They'd been sitting at a table near the window. At the table adjacent to them, 2 men had been talking. Both of them were, as far as anyone could determine, in the property development or investment space. The kind of professional conversation that sounds like a foreign language to outsiders, but carries meaning to those who know the vocabulary. One of them was describing a platform. A curated contractor matching platform with a quality assurance layer and a proprietary vetting methodology. He was describing it to his companion with the particular enthusiasm of someone who has recently discovered something they believe in. He mentioned the recent funding round. He mentioned the waiting list. He mentioned an interview, a podcast, actually, one of those property industry shows with a modest but precisely targeted audience, where the founder had spoken at length about the origin of the model. He mentioned the name. My name. Felicity heard it. According to what I was told, she didn't react immediately. She kept her coffee cup in her hands. She kept her expression neutral. But her conversation with Petra stopped. Just stopped, mid-sentence, and Petra, who noticed, asked if she was okay. She said she was fine. She was listening. The men continued. The one who'd been speaking mentioned the expansion plans. We were beginning conversations about moving into the commercial renovation space, a step we'd discussed publicly in that podcast interview. He mentioned the investors. He mentioned the scale of the waiting list in terms that were accurate to our current numbers. At some point she understood, with the full weight of understanding, that they were talking about Callum Walsh. Her Callum Walsh. The man whose suitcases she had packed on a Tuesday night in November. The man who had quietly carried them to the elevator and stood on the sidewalk and said drive safe and gone back upstairs. The comfortable one. The one who wasn't going anywhere. Petra asked again if she was okay. Felicity said, I need a minute. She excused herself. She went to the bathroom. She was in there for several minutes. When she came back, the men at the next table were leaving. She heard them wrap up the conversation as she returned to her seat, heard one of them say, worth keeping an eye on, in the offhand tone of someone making a note for later. She sat back down. She didn't drink her coffee. Petra, to her credit, didn't push. They left 20 minutes later. Felicity stood on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop and stood very still for a moment in the June light, which by all accounts was abundant that day. Then she got on the subway. She reached out 11 days later. I want to tell you I was surprised. I wasn't entirely. George's call and Rosalie's call had felt like weather systems, the kind that precedes something else. It was a text message on a Sunday morning. Hey, I know this is probably strange. I'd love to catch up if you're open to it. No agenda. Just, I've been thinking about things. I read it. I sat with it. I thought about the Sunday mornings we'd had in that apartment. The bad coffee and the good newspapers. Her feet in my lap. I thought about the brunch and the precise terrible sentence and the note on the laptop screen. I thought about Conrad at that diner saying, interestingly unfinished. I thought about the moment the term sheet crossed the table. I thought about Preston's message at 11 p.m. Check the analytics. I put my phone down. I made coffee, good coffee, because I'd finally bought a proper machine, and stood at the kitchen window and watched the neighborhood for a while. Then I picked the phone back up and typed, Hi Felicity. I appreciate you reaching out. I genuinely hope you're well. I don't think coffee is something I'm available for right now, not because of any bad feelings, but because I've moved to a different place and I'd like to stay there. Take care of yourself. I sent it. I want to be clear about what that message was and wasn't. It wasn't revenge. I wasn't performing indifference while secretly savoring the moment. It wasn't a performance at all. It was the simple truth. I had moved to a different place. Not geographically, not professionally, though both of those things were true, but somewhere internal. The place where her assessment of me had lived, where I'd stored the brunch comment and the laptop note and the suitcases, was no longer a wound I was working around. It had become something else. Evidence, maybe. Material. She replied 20 minutes later. I understand. I really do. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. What you've built. It's remarkable. I read it. I didn't reply. Not out of cruelty. There was simply nothing more to say. There are things I kept to myself during those 5 years that I've never fully accounted for, and I want to account for them now because they reframe what this story is actually about. In our second year together, when Felicity was between jobs for 4 months after her previous employer restructured, I paid the rent. All of it. Without discussion, without a running tally, without the kind of transactional accounting that some couples do. She was stressed enough about the search. I didn't want money to be another thing to manage. She never asked how I was covering it. I didn't tell her that I'd delayed drawing a salary from my own business for 3 months to make the math work. I just kept making the math work. In our third year, when her father had a health scare and she flew to Cincinnati on short notice and stayed for 2 weeks, I handled everything at home. The apartment, the utility issue that came up, the package she'd been expecting for a client. I also found a specialist in New York she'd mentioned wanting a second opinion from and arranged the appointment and paid the deposit because she was distracted and the appointment had a narrow availability window. She never knew I'd arranged it. I told her it was a referral from a friend. When we got engaged, I spent more on the ring than I'd told her I was planning to spend. Not to impress anyone. She never knew the actual number, but because she'd mentioned once, in passing, while we were watching some program about something else entirely, that she thought understated engagement rings were often a sign of understated intent. She'd said it without looking at me. I'd filed it away. I'm not telling you these things to construct a ledger in my favor. I'm telling you because they complicate the picture Felicity had assembled of me, the comfortable one, the static one, the one who wasn't going anywhere. The truth is more nuanced and more human than that. I was a man who cared, deeply and in ways that rarely announced themselves, for a woman who had decided that invisible care was the same as absence, who had confused visible ambition with actual love, who had looked at a man quietly carrying her weight and seen only a man who was standing still. The renovations I'd done on our relationship, the structural work, the load-bearing adjustments no one ever sees, those didn't register on whatever scoreboard she was keeping. I think about that sometimes. Not with bitterness, just with the particular sadness of someone who understands that some people can only measure what they can see. By the following autumn, the platform had 230 active contractor partners across the New York metro area and a client base that had grown, month over month, with a consistency that made our original projections look modest. We'd closed a second funding round. We'd made our first 2 hires beyond the founding team. A head of operations named Simone who had more organizational intelligence than anyone I'd met, and a partnership lead named Dev who had grown up in the construction industry and spoke every room's language. Preston and I had moved into a proper office by then. Nothing extravagant, a sensible space in Chelsea with good light and a conference room that could fit 8 people without anyone feeling crowded. Conrad came to see it in October. He walked around the room slowly, looking at things. Then he sat down and said, Okay, you did it. From Conrad. That was a standing ovation. Georgia and I had coffee occasionally now, genuinely, as something like friends, without the complicated gravity of her connection to Felicity pulling at the interaction. She was good company. She'd always been good company. I think I'd been too close to the social structure around Felicity to see her clearly before. Rosalie had sent flowers when the second round closed, with a note that said, "I always knew." I smiled at that. I appreciated the sentiment and disbelieved it completely and found both responses entirely reasonable. Felicity, I heard, third hand, from the kind of information that filters through mutual connections in a city that's too large to navigate and too small to hide in, had moved to a better apartment. She was seeing someone in finance, apparently. She was fine. I was glad she was fine. I mean that plainly. The version of me who'd stood on that sidewalk watching taillights had more complicated feelings. This version, the one in the Chelsea office with the good light, had arrived somewhere simpler. She had needed something specific. I was not that thing. That had been painful, and then it had been clarifying, and then it had been fuel, and then it had become simply a fact about the past, belonging to the past, living there quietly. I still have a photo, somewhere on my phone, from the trip to Portugal, the one I bought the Navy suitcase for. We're on a hillside in Lisbon in afternoon light, and we're both laughing at something I can't remember now. We were happy in that photo. I believe that completely. It didn't change anything. It didn't need to. I had dinner with Conrad on a Thursday in November, at a proper restaurant this time. His choice, the kind of place with cloth napkins that gets replaced if you use them. He ordered wine and talked about his own early years in business, which he almost never did. He talked about a woman he'd been engaged to at 31 who had believed in him absolutely, who had worked evenings to help fund his first venture, who was still his wife at 61. The right person, he said, makes the work easier. Not because they do any of it for you, but because you're not doing it while also defending your belief in yourself. I sat with that. I understand that better now, I said. He nodded, poured more wine. You will again, he said. Someone worth the understanding. We finished dinner and split the check. Outside, the city was doing its November thing, cold and lit and indifferent and alive. I walked to the subway with my hands in my pockets, and I felt, in the clearest and most unambiguous way I can describe, at peace. Not victorious. Not vindicated, particularly. Just at peace. There's a difference. Victory requires someone to have lost. I didn't need Felicity to have lost. I just needed to have found something. The company, the focus, the proof of my own capacity that had always been there, waiting for the circumstances that would make it visible. She had believed she was leaving my future. She was wrong about that. Not spitefully wrong. Just wrong. In the ordinary human way of being wrong about people. Seeing a present state and mistaking it for a permanent one. Seeing stillness and reading it as stasis. Looking at a man who was still becoming and deciding the becoming would never happen. I didn't need her to know she was wrong. The knowing existed independently of her. The work was real. The company was real. The peace was real. All of it was real without her. The woman who thought she was leaving my future eventually realized she had walked away from it.